Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. The meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump wasn't as awkward as many thought it might be. There were hugs, promise of things to come and talks of a strong relationship. Prime Minister Modi became the first foreign leader to enjoy a White House dinner since Trump came to power, and the two leaders discussed a range of issues. India and the United States vowed to strengthen cooperation against terror outfits like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Toiba, while urging Pakistan to ensure that its soil is not used for terror strikes against other nations. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will take a closer look at the takeaways from the Prime Minister's visit to the United States. Joining me on the program today are Vivek, Katju, former ambassador; Bharat, Karnad, research professor, National Security Studies, Center for Policy Research; Saurabh, Srivastava, chairman, Emeritus, NASSCOM; and Priya, Ranjan, senior journalist. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Srivastava, I'd like to begin with you. From your point of view, what were the three key takeaways?
Well, the biggest takeaway is usually about chemistry, because there's always about a million issues that two leaders like this have to tackle. That short meeting isn't about going into details on those and reaching a conclusion. I think there's a lot of people in both countries in the administrative level that have been working on it. It is really whether the two leaders can get a certain amount of trust with each other, can begin to be comfortable that they can deal with each other on difficult issues. So I thought the good thing was that they focused on areas of conversion, not diversion, and that allowed them to get on to the right start. And quite separately, Prime Minister Modi had an excellent meeting with CEOs. Most of the technology heads were there. And those were discussions of huge importance both for India and for those companies. So I would say, all in all, we should be comfortable that we got what we wanted out of it. I certainly was not expecting there to be any great fireworks. The good thing is that there was no negativity. And everybody is aware that President Trump is mercurial in that regard.
Okay, no negativity is the greatest positivity is what you're saying. Let me bring in Ambassador Katju into the picture as well. Ambassador, there was a lot of skepticism that this meeting could be awkward between Trump and Modi, especially after what happened, after what Trump said when the United States backed out of the Paris Climate Accord. But everything seemed to have gone on well.
I think the Americans went out of the way to ensure that the atmospherics of the visit were excellent, and Trump made significant gestures. I think Mrs. Trump need not have come out to welcome the Prime Minister, but she did, and that was in itself a gesture. But this talk of personal chemistry, my own experience as a diplomat, as a former diplomat now, has been that chemistry is important among leaders, but at the end of the day, it is the national agendas and the priorities that the leaders have that determine the actual substance of a relationship. Yes, some direction can be given by leaders, but beyond that, the real meat lies in what actually transpires when the two systems get together. And it is here that I think there was a certain adroitness that was adopted. The issues on which there is convergence came out. Let's take security, for instance. On Afghanistan, the joint statement that issued mentioned India's role and India's involvement in the security sector in Afghanistan, which I think was good. On Pakistan, of course, it was quite extraordinary that the Americans accepted to name Pakistan, and the two leaders allowed that their president, along with the Prime Minister, called on Pakistan to ensure, and that word is a hard word, to ensure that its territory was not used for terrorism. But that indicates that the Americans are getting a little angry when it comes to Pakistani terror through the Taliban in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, I do not know whether this will be sufficient to change Pakistani conduct. Now, on a couple of things on trade, which is something which the President has stressed for his domestic audience and it's part of his domestic agenda, there was no give on the part of President Trump, and I think it was straightforward talk in his press statement. He said that he expects fair and reciprocal treatment, but that means that they want access for their goods in greater measure, but are they willing to give us some give on areas of our strengths like services?
Right.
And there was no indication. And finally, as far as the Paris Accord is concerned, which you mentioned, it was ducking a bouncer. And bouncers can be ducked on such occasions, but they can't be ducked all the time.
Sure, fair enough. Professor Karnad, I'd like to bring you in and talk about some of the contentious issues, that India has been pushing for in the past, for instance, permanent membership to the UNSC or the NSG for that matter. Do you believe that Americans will support our bids in both those endeavors?
Well, look, sorry, they might do so in a sort of a half-hearted way. There has to be, as you know, the UNSC membership has been a long-standing issue with with great many claimants who also want to join from different areas of the world. And there are rivals who are trying to pull them down in South Asia, Pakistan, China, and most of the permanent five, have a veto power as to who joins them. So it's not going to be easy, and I think India should not waste, and that's been my argument over the years.
So you do not see the United States going out of the way to try and get...
No, they are not even, that's not even an issue. I don't think that this government is going to push that, because it'll be waste of political capital. You have to choose where to invest your political capital, which is scarce, like money. You can't just be, squandering it all over the place. So that's not going to happen. NSG is a slightly different kettle of fish, in the sense that right now we have only China standing up against India. But let's say if Trump and his administration were to prevail upon, or they feel convinced that India needs to get into the NSG, and they decide on their own, unilaterally, that the US will accord India status of nuclear supplier member, meaning you have the license to do so. India has a license already,
Yes.
in an informal way. But if America recognizes it on a bilateral basis, that clears the way. It doesn't matter what China does or doesn't do. Again, I'm not so sure that that's going to happen, because it'll be political capital expenditure on their part on an issue that is ultimately secondary, if not tertiary, to their concerns. So these are the sorts of, I think, balances and imbalances that you have in relations in terms of issue matter. That said, I think Trump did indicate, he talked about needing greater openness in the Indian market for American products to access, like farm produce and so on and so forth. The point I think that he's going to push, and this is where I suspect Washington is going to begin pushing, you already have a $30 billion deficit, trade imbalance favoring India. How are you going to make up the $30 billion annually? The Americans say by buying more. That's what they said in the joint statement.
Yes.
Buy more. What could India buy from the United States? Trump says buy more hardware, military hardware. Maybe make the best weapons, fine, but there's only so much hardware we can buy, to integrate into our forces and our force structure. So there's limitation there. And if you're going to do that, there'll be the questions being asked here at this end as to what it is that the Americans are going to give up. And if there's no give on the H-1B immigration, those aspects of the flow of services, free flow of services, and so on, and skilled manpower, then it becomes politically dicey for the Modi government.
Right.
Even though in the larger scale, they might equalize the trade to explain and justify to the Indian audiences here.
Indeed, indeed, sure. Let me bring in Priya Ranjan Dash as well. Mr. Dash, you know, a lot of emphasis there on trade deficit and also lowering trade barriers. Do you see some kind of movement in that direction?
Yes. You see, number one is that in the arena of trade, the Trump administration is moving away from multilateralism, increasingly so. So it prefers doing business on a bilateral basis. So given that, perhaps one would have expected that India and US would enter into a negotiation process for a bilateral trade liberalization, trade facilitation arrangement, which could be a free trade arrangement, not exactly, but so the declaration, the joint declaration, falls short of that, but nevertheless talks about a comprehensive review of the trade relations, including the regulatory framework that you have on both sides, and most importantly, market access. And some of the areas have been mentioned, including, importantly, IT services. So that's a positive from India's point of view. There's also mentioned about market access in agriculture, for instance. Now, insofar as the regulatory, facilitating and removing the regulatory obstacles that you have, and recognizing, there is also a mention of the IPR issue in the form of recognizing inventions, protecting intellectual property rights. Now, the two work in this sector of pharmaceuticals, for instance. Now, whereas Indian companies and players are facing regulatory issues in US,
right,
and given this comprehensive review of the trade relationship that is on the cards now, the two sides would be looking at some solution to that, which is a positive from our point of view.
Sure.
At the same time, this insistence on looking at the protection for intellectual property rights and all that, which has been boggy, I would say, from the US pharmaceuticals lobbies. That is again something that would block the way rather than clearing the way.
Sure, sure.
And you see, there is no upping of the ambitious bilateral trade targets which had been fixed, of taking it from the present levels to $500 billion and things like that. There is not even a reiteration of that.
I'd like to bring in Mr. Srivastava at this point in time. Mr. Srivastava, do you believe that, trade, commerce and investment are going to be areas of mutual cooperation going forward?
They are very important. They're very important for the US. President Trump has made that his main agenda. They're very important for India. High economic growth is very important for us. And we are really natural allies and partners. I don't mean geopolitically and democracy, but really in trade and investment. So I don't find disturbing the mention about fair trade and about reciprocity, because that also gives us a window to push our point on services. This isn't only about goods. And right now, as I was mentioning the other day, if you look at most of the large technology players in America, India is the number, outside of the US, India is usually their number one or number two market. This is very important for them. And no wonder they were all there to meet with the Prime Minister. They will make the adjustments they need to make to do business in India. It's too big a market for them to ignore. And equally, for most of these companies to thrive and grow, they need Indian talent. Many of them have Indian-born CEOs. So it's a very strong alliance. It's a very strong alliance in the startup ecosystem, very strong alliance in the venture capital, private equity investment ecosystem. So we have to make our case well. Today, we are very open to capital coming in from the US, in private equity, in venture capital, in most areas, technology related. There are no restrictions on ownership, on many of those. Our companies in IT are creating hundreds of thousands of jobs in America. So our case needs to be better stated in many ways. And on this H-1B, the reality is even before President Trump came into power, the number of H-1Bs that Indian companies are using has been declining.
Right.
Because there's a paradigm shift in how companies operate. There's a different business model coming in. So they are important. They're not the be-all and end-all.
Sure. Fair enough. Let me bring in Ambassador Katju into the picture now. Ambassador. Okay, Ambassador is not with us right now. We'll try and reconnect with him. But in the meantime, Professor Karnad, you know, the drones, do you believe that that's going to be a big deal as far as India is concerned? How much is it really going to have an impact on India?
Yeah, I think what the Indian government had asked for and what the military certainly wanted were the armed drones, the armed predator.
That's not coming, is it?
That's not coming. It was denied expressly by Washington because I think their concern is that it'll, these predators will be used against the, HET and,
but is it going to help
other...
in surveillance in the Indian Ocean region?
Well, yeah, but surveillance, maritime surveillance, situational awareness and so on in the maritime domain is one thing. And the Americans have led us to believe that, well, the armed drones could come in the future. But take this as
is it a start?
Confidence building thing from their point of view. Their confidence needs to be built is what they claim. Now, the point I think is something slightly different. It is a more, it's a larger issue here. The Americans have been talking about very advanced military technology collaboration in the military sphere since the 1980s. Not one project has fructified. Not one. Yes, they have encouraged off-the-shelf buys, which we have done, C-17s, the C-130s, the P-8Is, the most recently the M777 howitzers and so on. But these are off-the-shelf buys. There's no TOT, technology transfer. There's nothing there. So it's just you pay the money, you get the goods. Now, when it comes actually to technology, you'll find that most of these are fairly safe. Safe in the sense that they're very low in the lethality index. Either they're old, like M77s are from, again, the 70s, early 70s. The F-16s that are on offer are from the late
obsolete
60s.
Technology, basically.
Yes, I mean, the Predator drone that they're giving us is unarmed. So it has led me to suggest that there's a very low lethality ceiling that the Americans have imposed on our hardware purchases, which is not a good thing, considering that India can access and get the very frontline cutting-edge stuff from Russia, which is why I think the government recognizes the problem that you might buy this, that, and the other fairly, fairly, shall we say, innocuous platforms, like this transporter, C-130s or C-17s and so on, which are not fighting assets. But when you come down to the fighting assets, Russia is open.
Sure.
You get the very best from them. Or most countries do not give the very best top cutting edge stuff, but they degrade the technology by about 30% and they give it to us. But you get relatively world-class platforms and weapons and armament systems, which is not the sort of thing that you can hope to access easily from the Americans.
Right.
And that's a fact of life, that the military, if they haven't already recognized, I think they should and will begin to recognize very soon. So that's, I think, the little fly in the ointment
right.
in this otherwise, hopefully, burgeoning relationship as both sides see it.
Sure. Ambassador You did mention Pakistan earlier and how the joint statement pulled up Pakistan in particular. Whether or not Pakistan will be deterred by this remains to be seen. But another thing that happened was, of course, the branding of Hizbul chief as a global terrorist. Now, what kind of an impact is that going to have in Kashmir? And also, I want to know how the Chinese are going to look at all these developments that have taken place in the United States.
Well, three things there. One, as you would have seen, the Pakistanis have reacted very angrily to the designation of Sayyid Salahuddin as a global terrorist. And that indicates clearly that they will not put any curbs on his movement. The second point is that I think in Kashmir, the signal will go that that the Kashmiri agitationists will get no purchase from the Americans. And if that be so, I think they will get no purchase from the wider international community, also from Europe. This has to be juxtaposed also with the demand that Pakistan should not use its territory for fostering terrorism. The third thing is, of course, China. I think the Chinese would see this as a clear American signal of a resolve that on terror they are extremely impatient with Pakistan. And I don't think that there's anything extraordinary there, because over the last 15 years and more, the Pakistanis have ensured that about 2,500 American soldiers have laid down their lives in Afghanistan because of Pakistan's support for the Afghan Taliban, the sanctuaries and the material support given to them. And I only wonder whether the Americans are signaling, and that the Chinese will pick up this signal, that they are quite upset with this aspect.
Right.
But there again, I think that unless the Americans are willing to take further action, then using their air assets, drones, etc., without Pakistani permission across the Durand, the Pakistanis will not be faced. The Pakistanis will only be deterred if the Americans signal that they are willing to put boots on the ground in Afghanistan. I don't mean in large numbers, but willing to go across the Durand to have punitive attacks, etc. But that is, I don't see the Trump administration reaching that stage now, if at all they will reach that stage ever.
All right, fair enough. Priya Ranjan Rash, you know, another thing that the joint statement, in fact, addressed was GST. Interestingly, Trump brought up GST as well. What kind of an impact is it really going to have between the two countries, if at all any?
See, GST is a great reform. And so, to that extent, it will have very huge economic impact on India, if not immediately, in the medium term. Now, so it's a very important development in terms of, if not for anything, in terms of the ease of doing business, because it's a piece of radical tax reform. So, and it is global, because most countries in the world today have adopted GST. India is late in doing that, to the extent that it provides a common Indian market that facilitates not only domestic economy, but also India's external linkages, including the partnership with the US. I would like to, draw your attention to two things in the trade arena with US. One is the energy issue. Now, given that the priorities have changed in the US, I tend to believe that the importance for the US in terms of pushing nuclear supplies, and for instance, the Westinghouse Hitachi kind of reactors that one was talking about now, the company has gone down, down under.
Right.
So till there is something about, because the company is bankrupt. So those kind of supplies are not relevant. And also, one knows that the priorities have changed. The Paris deal is off insofar as the US is concerned, and it would be more interested in pushing, the traditional hydrocarbon kind of thing, be it so-called clean coal or, shale gas and things like that.
Right.
Which can then, of course, India can use it as a leverage for energy sourcing. So that is something that I would like to point out.
Sure.
The other thing is,
very quickly, because I'm running out of time.
What I want to tell you is that this reciprocity that that is being mentioned is a good thing.
Sure.
Because India would be very happy in having a large trade deficit with vis-a-vis US, because such a trade deficit would actually mean India tapping into foreign savings, that is the US savings, for its development.
Indeed.
Provided the volume, the two-way trade volume is large.
Sure.
On a large two-way trade volume, like with China, if you have a trade deficit, even if India has a trade deficit, it will be to its India's advantage. So there will be no problem with that.
I've got 2 minutes left on the program, so quick closing comments from all my guests now, beginning with you, Mr. Srivastava. In 30 seconds, do you believe that this meeting has set the tone for things to come in the future?
Yes, I believe it has. I think, to my mind, it has eased a lot of nervousness and concerns that people had on both these leaders, both mercurial, both strong, both very aggressive, both very focused on their own countries. Would they be able to meet on common ground? And they have done that. And I would just say on technology, the earlier comments are valid. We will actually never get the very best of defense technologies from any country. It is unconscionable for a country of our size to still depend on that.
I'm sorry to cut you short, but I'd like to bring in the others as well, because I'm running out of time on the program. Ambassador Katju, very quickly, you mentioned about Afghanistan, but without Pakistan, what can the US really do in Afghanistan?
Well, they can do a great deal if they want to restrain Pakistan. But as I said, it means actually taking on the Pakistanis on the ground in Pakistan. It means that they'll have to change their entire approach, which till now has been to lean on Pakistan to persuade the Taliban to have a rapprochement with the national unity government. And I don't see that change taking place.
Right. Professor Karnad, this talk about this joint naval exercise with Japan, India, US and Japan, what is the significance of it?
No, I think it's one of the manifestations of precisely the kind of collective security we are talking about, that the US has invested in, perhaps not as much as in the Obama years or previously. And that's what we need to build on, independent of the United States.
Sure.
It's in our interest, and of Japan's and Australia and the littoral countries in Southeast Asia, to ring-fence China.
Right.
So it doesn't really matter whether the Americans get into the act or not. It's in our interest, the Asian interest, to collectively ensure that China is hedged.
A last final word from you, Mr. Dash.
Well, I think there are no fresh initiative though, but the continuation and the relationship with the US is so diverse that there couldn't have been, any negative, I would say. But it doesn't take it very further, because it would have been interesting had, the dialogue groups had to be reconstituted. Those kind of initiatives haven't come, which would have been a good thing to sort of carry it forward.
All right. On that note, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Vivek, Katju, Bharat, Karnad, Saurabh, Srivastava, Priya, Ranjan, Dash. Thank you so much for joining me on the program. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.